For this session, we want to talk about global migration governance in all of its particulars. I shouldn't say all of its particulars, but a lot of its particulars. And to talk about global migration governance, I think it's helpful to first talk about what is global governance. As we're talking about global governance, I think it's helpful to start by saying, what do we mean by governance and what do we mean by global? That might seem a little bit basic, or for some of you, if it's already clear, I apologize if this seems a bit too elementary, but I think it's important to start from the ground up at the most basic, define these terms, and work our way up into some of the particulars of the various regimes involved. So when we talk about global migration governance, I think the first question is, what is global governance? And I think a good way to approach that is to start with the concept of governance. By governance, we don't mean government, but governance includes government. Governance refers broadly to norms, rules, and institutions that incentivize and constrain behavior. It refers to processes and structures that make regulatory decisions and facilitate coordination. So in this sense, we should think of governance as being at the same time something that is bigger than government, but also something that is smaller than government. It ranges from international organizations, transnational organizations. It includes states and the interstate system, but it also includes smaller actors, any corporations or NGOs. These are part of global governance. These are part of governance. And primarily what's at stake here is when you're talking about domestic law, domestic government, we can speak about government very clearly, very easily, because there is a sovereign, there is a state, there is a legislative body, there is enforcement capacity. When a government passes laws, it has not only the capacity to draft, create, pass laws, but to enforce them and make decisions in that regard. At the global level, there is no clear sovereign authority. There is no jurisdiction that approximates that of the sovereign state domestically. So rather than global government, which would effectively be a one world state or some sort of world empire, it's the only way you could really think about global government. Even the United Nations doesn't quite rise to the level of government. It's an international organization, but it doesn't have government authority in the sense that a state does internally. So what do we mean by global? Well, of course, we all know what global means, but it's important to remember that it's not the same as international. When we talk about global, we don't just mean the international. So when we say international, what we're invoking is the system of states, interchanges and relations between states. International refers to diplomacy, trade agreements, matters of war and peace. These are the connections, relations, and engagements between states, and we call that international. But global is a little bit bigger than that. Global is meant to sweep up all things at the world level. So global includes all sorts of actors and institutions and processes that are not state-based, that are not confined to the state system. So at the global level, we have you think of transnational organizations like private corporations, multinational corporations. They would be a global governance actor that do not fall within the system of states. They're not a state. So we wouldn't say that they are part of the international system. They're a little bit outside the international system. They interact with the international system, but they're a little bit different qualitatively. So global is meant to refer to the system of states and all of that. And probably the system of states is the most important aspect of global governance, the most predominant set of actors and systems in global politics, global governance, is the system of states. But of course, they're not alone. There's civil society. We think about religion and culture, NGOs and corporations. All of these constitute systems and processes and actors at the global level. So we say then that global refers to international plus the transnational. That's the state system plus the non-state cross-border human connections. So global is multi-actor. It's constituted by many different kinds of actors. That's primarily states and international organizations, but also civil society, NGOs. Think about Oxfam, Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch. These are sort of human rights organizations that are in the NGO civil sector society component of global governance, and private sector. Not just private corporations, but trade boards, credit agencies, these things that sort of have a lot of interactions with states, but are acting outside of the state system for the most part. When we talk about global governance, it's not just multi-actor, it's also multi-level. So of course, there's the systemic level of the system of states, that's the international. Then there's the national level, the level of domestic governments. Then there's subnational, there's regional within states, but there's also regional spanning groups of states, sub-regional, down to the municipal level, municipal levels of government. And it's important to also add that global includes the local. When we talk about global, there's a place for the local in there. There can be local actions, local actors, local movements that have a play or an interplay with world politics. So global really goes from the very bottom to the very top and spans all different types of actors at different levels. And again, global is sort of a term for the world as a whole. And the notion of transnational, just to distinguish again here more clearly, international from transnational. The international is again those formal state institutions. Think of international law. That is law between states that applies to states. Transnational then is anything that crosses a border but is not confined to or restricted in or defined by that system of states. So that could be a regional culture or a corporation, a multinational corporation that would be transnational. Transnational, as soon as you're crossing one border, you're in the domain of transnational. If you're spanning transboundary across an individual international boundary, you're in the domain of the transnational. And the global is meant to invoke sort of the largest level of that. So turning now, we've sort of really tried to define in the most basic terms what global governance refers to. So let's zero in on global migration governance. What is the global governance of migration? And as we put in our definition on the previous slide here, for governance, if governance refers broadly to norms, rules, and institutions, as well as decision-making bodies and decision-making processes, and I want to sort of isolate some of these for global migration governance. And look in turn at some of the norms underpinning migration governance, some of the major actors in global migration governance, and then maybe some of the reference points for rules. Starting with norms. I'm curious to know if other folks can think of some other norms that should be on here, or if some of these norms maybe aren't worded quite correctly. But norms are expectations in behavior. They're sort of principles about how people ought to act or how institutions ought to function or societies ought to work. And norms generally aren't written down, they're not codified, they're not treaties, but they're basic sort of almost like moral or ethical statements about the way we want the world to be. A norm is something that is meant to be normalized. So I think a major norm underpinning migration governance is that people should be free to travel. You know, just in simple terms, there's this real sense that people ought to be able to travel. And that's a norm, I think, that is sort of at the core or kernel of a lot of the kinds of rules and institutions that get built up around these basic ideas. Another related one is that people should have the opportunity to migrate. To simply put, people should have an opportunity to migrate. Notice that these are kind of couched in a soft language of should. or ought. And third, travel and migration enrich the human experience. Sort of what we take for granted. Yes, people should be free to travel. People should have some opportunity to migrate if they want or need. And moreover, these are social goods. It enriches the human experience. And a fourth one I've put down is the international community should help people who have been forced to flee their countries. Sort of the basic norm underpinning the way we think about refugees. So basically, if people are being forced to flee their country, some sort of expectation that the international community should provide some assistance. And I'd be curious to hear again if anybody has any alternative ways of thinking about these norms or something that is maybe missing from this slide. Please.
Yeah, I remember what I wanted to say with your last question before we broke is that I realized with that comment about the neighboring countries that, for example, with a Mexican passport, the visas that are required for Canada and the US, which, as I mentioned in my own mobility, I have visas, but it's still very hard. So in terms of like the norms as ideals, I think there's yes, it's like idea of like people should be able to move and then passport mobility, but these all are only available for like people who have the resources to actually do it. It's like yeah, it means something that the Mexican passport is a strong passport, but then if you can travel to your neighboring countries, which the costs will be lower, then does it really matter that you can go to Europe if only a certain amount of people from that region, from that country, can actually have the resources to pay for a transatlantic flight? So there's kind of like this, yes, let's say like the rules or like the norms are these ideals, but in practice and where governance comes in is like how to make it as hard as possible for people who are not the most mobile already to be able to like follow these norms or
Yeah, and I think that's very helpful to use the word ideals because these aren't rules. They're deliberately sort of soft or ambiguous in their wording. They're kind of fuzzy concepts. It's the norm is not that we think that every single person in the world should be free to travel anywhere they want, or that every single person in the world should must have every opportunity to migrate. Ideally, yes. But I think just as a basic starting point, we could couch it in these kind of terms that people generally should have some opportunity to migrate. So it is a very weak statement, and I think deliberately so. And we know that norms are violated all the time. The systems that are often meant to serve them will often violate them. And there will always be exceptions where some people get excluded or some actors in the system block opportunities. And this is always going to be the case, but the norms are always sort of pushing us to reform and legislate and work towards these ideals to normalize the norms, I guess. Yeah.
yeah. And if I may say something else, also like with this idea of like only 3% of the world population actually migrates versus the amount of coverage and kind of securitization trends that we see at the global level that is maybe not proportionate to the 3% of the world population actually wanting to move. So then I am coming back to these kind of more regional governance ideas, which is kind of what I'm transitioning into thinking for my after my PhD. Um, like I think it is something to think about global migration when in reality it is harder to regulate or have these ideals at a regional level where the dynamics might be more than 3%. And then that's where you're talking about more actual implementation challenges.
Right, like that 3.6% is not a representative sample of the world population. And I think this was a point that our reading made really well about, sometimes just even trying to talk about the global or frame things in the global is very problematic. It's very generalized and simplified. That maybe a more effective practical focus is the region, looking at regions of the world to sort of try and think about these things, because regions are where you'll find much more comparison and similarity or likeness between experiences and populations. Any other thoughts? Sorry, Madison, I just want to revisit that comment. I think there could be consideration for people accessing work in different states. It is one thing for travel to be normalized, but fair and decent work ought to be a norm. Yes, I think that's a good point. That there's something elective about travel for leisure versus something that is very necessary for life and survival in work and employment. So I think that that's maybe what you're getting at. So norms of global governance. Let's say a little bit about some of the actors or the specific institutions that are the bodies that are involved uh, in governance of global migration. First and foremost, states. States are the most important, the most prominent, and the most powerful actor in determining the rules and regulations and expectations around global migration. States of sovereignty. Under international law, states have the right to self determine their borders and their migration policy. So we're dealing with trying to normalize some principles and enhance coordination uh, between a world dominated by different states that have different perspectives, changing governments, and their own economic and security interests. And this is typically what drives state policy. If you want to know what states are doing with their borders and migration policy, look to their economic and security interests. They might talk a lot about migration or values, but at the end of the day, the way states tend to function is they make cost benefit analysis with their economic ambitions and their perceived security needs. And this is going to be what's determining uh, the choices and policies that states take up. After states, I think we would say international organizations. These are organizations of states. For example, the International Organization for Migration under the UN, the IOM. We'll say a little bit more about the IOM in just a minute as a bit of a case study, as an example of an international organization in the global migration governance regime. That's an example of an organization that is embedded within a larger international organization, the UN, and the members of the organization are not people. The members are not NGO, civil society. The members of an international organization, an IO, are states. Another example of an international organization very relevant here is the ILO, that's the International Labor Organization. The ILO is a much older organization than the IOM. The International Labor Organization predates World War II, and it is treaty based. It's an inclusive organization. It's a classical sort of international organization with strict state membership and treaty constituted by a treaty. And if reading through the required text for this session, we learned that in many ways, the International Labor Organization is perhaps the best poised organization to be dealing with global migration governance. We might think, well, why it's focused on labor? But recall that the large majority of migrants internationally are economic migrants. So labor concerns are a major concern for global migration in general. And part of the weakness with the International Labor Organization is that it's one state, one vote. And so you have all these different states with different ideologies. And then in particular, during the Cold War, this organization ceased to be very effective because you had sort of the communist blocs of countries making up the organization challenging or clashing with the capitalist, sort of liberal Western bloc of countries in the organization. So on the one hand, you have this very socialist, leftist sort of set of interests trying to pull the organization one way, really heavy into labor organizing, regulation, labor standards and benefits and safety nets. And the other side, which is pushing the other way, saying no, more power to management, more power to the corporations. So the ILO became kind of a battleground ideologically. And I think it's suggested in the reading that the IOM sort of rose up in kind of because the ILO had not been able to come to a lot of consensus. And the International Organization for Migration then is a little bit more of a technocratic organization. It's got a lot going on, it's got a lot of moving pieces, and it's more about kind of technocratic governance coordination. And it's not quite so subject to the kind of ideological considerations of it's a one member, one vote. There's a lot of different bodies and councils that make up the IOM. Another important actor at the level of IOs is the Refugee Agency. That's the UNHCR, the High Commission for Refugees is the UN Refugee Agency. And this was established to manage the governance of the 1951 Refugee Convention. Another related IO that's involved in global migration governance is the UN Human Rights Organization, often known as the Office of the High Commissioner of Human Rights, the OHCHR or OCHR, or it's just referred to as UN Human Rights. And this is a little bit broader than strictly migration issues, but there are a lot of human rights issues that overlap with the migration issue. So, for example, you think about exploitative labor or human trafficking, child labor, all of these sorts of things that are sort of where human rights issues overlap with migration issues. And all of these so far are at the level of international organization in a very general or universal way, specifically through the UN. But you have comparable agencies and organizations in regional international organizations as well. The EU for Europe, ECOWAS for Western Africa, ASEAN for the Asian region, Mercosur for South American regional governance. So each of these is sort of like a little bit like UNs, but on a regional level. These organizations are typically driven by what motivates them, their legal mandates and their charters. Then the third category of actors of global migration governance is the NGO sector, the non-governmental organizations. Some examples of major players here are Migrant Rights International. It was founded not by states, but by civil society organizations. Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, Oxfam. And these sorts of organizations are driven typically by humanitarian concerns. So having said a little bit about the actors of global migration governance, we can say just a little bit more about the IOM. We'll put the spotlight on the International Organization for Migration. Now, I have the sort of the mandate from I don't know why I can't see my presenter. Okay, this is from the website of the International Organization for Migration, sort of like their mission statement. The organization works on the development of policy guidance for the field, the formulation of global strategies, standard setting and quality control, knowledge management relating to mainstream migration sectors, including labor and facilitated migration, migration and development, counter trafficking, assisted voluntary return, migration health, assistance to vulnerable migrants, immigration and border management, and overall capacity building in migration management. So a lot of very technocratic kind of jargon about the many different things that this organization is trying to do. A relatively young organization that seemed to overtake a lot of the kind of the purpose of the ILO, especially in the 1990s. This organization is by a factor of about 10 larger than the older ILO. This organization has about 400 offices around the world, 20,000 employees, an annual budget of $1 billion. So massive bureaucracy of technocratic management. And one of the major maybe the spearhead, the tip of the spear of this organization is its migration management agenda. And it outlines as the three pillars of this migration management agenda as harmonization, practices, and narratives. That's harmonization through intergovernmental organizing, harmonization through knowledge production, and through professionalization or standardization of practices and data collection and all of that. In terms of the practices that the organization focuses on, service provision, capacity building, multi-level coordination. This organization is also active at the level of discourse or narrative. That is, they have a mandate to go out there and reinforce the benefits of a world with more migration. They have some frames of reference. A major talking point is the triple win of migration. What is the triple win of migration? The notion that migration benefits three parties. Migration benefits the migrant, it benefits the receiving country, and it benefits the country of origin. That in a proper world of well-managed international migration, an active migration should serve all three parties. And part of the narrative agenda of the IOM is to try to counteract or dispel a lot of the anti-immigrant discourses that we've been referring to. Something that we didn't really specify, but I was thinking about at the time, was I think that migrant populations are very easy to scapegoat. This is why it tends to be so prevalent in a reductive political kind of situation. In a situation where a population doesn't have a lot of trust in the authorities, they're going to look for who to blame. What is the cause of some of our problems? And often it's easy to scapegoat the more vulnerable populations or populations that have an identity, a visual identity marker that sets them apart. So someone who appears foreign is identified as an immigrant and is identified or scapegoated as a part of the problem. And these are the kinds of narratives that the IOM is out there trying to counteract, arming people with good data, sharing the data through the various channels to government agencies, to their PR outlets. I think there's a comment here. Oh, that was you. Oh, go ahead. Liliana?
Hi. Yeah, I've never heard this before. This is really interesting because I think the fieldwork I'm doing in Mexico, the IOM is like mainly responsible for like deportations. Like they organize forced returns of transit migrants trying to reach the US. And I'm just curious like how that fits into like this mandate as described, because it's not mentioned as one of their like three pillars, but that's like mainly what one hears about them getting up to. And also, yeah.
That's really interesting. Now, I might be a bit out of my depth here. You said this was for the way the IOM, the role of the IOM in Mexico, or the ILM?
No, this is the IOM. The UN receives funding from the United States to deport transit migrants from Mexico to their home countries, and that's like the one of the main things they do here. They have, yeah, they organize flights, they send people back, and that doesn't seem to fit into like and what's being shared, and I'm curious about yeah, just like how that fits into this mission.
Right. So just so I'm 100% clear, you're talking about the IOM, not the ILM, right?
I don't know what the ILM is. I'm talking about the IOM, the organization that is on this slide.
Right. Yes. So we were saying that the IOM overtook the ILM. The ILM is the International Labor Organization that used to have a much more progressive, equity-based, human rights-focused kind of agenda. One of the things the International Organization for Migration, the IOM, the younger organization, this beefier organization that receives all of this funding, this technocratic body of governance, one of the things it's criticized for is sort of serving as a neoliberal manager of state interests around these issues. Whereas the critics say that this work should be in the hands of the ILM, not the IOM. And I think our reading does a really good job of raising questions about how the IOM came to this position of prominence in the global governance of migration, that suddenly it's the major organization receiving all the funding. And it's one of the youngest international organizations. It really was only fully established in the 1990s. And it didn't even begin as a UN organization. It just sort of started, it kind of butted itself into the UN system, started branding itself as the UN, and with a lot of donor money and a lot of connections, it has sort of established itself as the front for international organizations on migration today. So I don't know anything about what you're describing in particular, but that fits in with my understanding of a lot of the criticism that this organization receives. It sounds like what's happening is, for all their talk of selling the goods and the bonuses, the pluses of migration, really this is a technocratic organization that's helping states serve their self-interest. And a lot of that money that they're receiving isn't to help people, refugees, migrants. It's to help states carry out their migration policies. So I think in the case of the Mexico situation that you're talking about, that's depressing and maybe a little bit shocking, but not too surprising given some of the criticism that has attached to this organization and some of its concerns around sort of just being a kind of a neoliberal front for us allowing states to preserve the status quo of inequalities that are already built into um, to global migration. I would be eager to hear if you have a follow up on that. But I think that's a great intervention on this topic. It really puts into perspective something that the reading was emphasizing. So that was a bit of a spotlight look at one particular prominent organization in among the actors of global migration governance. Let's turn now to some of the rules. What are the source of the rules? What are the documents or the institutions they're embedded in? The rules come first and foremost from national law. This gets back to states being the most important actor. Well, their rules are the most important rules. The rules they set for their border policy and their migration policy. States legislate within the context. While states do have all of this sovereignty over these policies, they're not operating in a vacuum. They still have to respond to domestic pressure, transnational pressure, global pressure. They're operating within the context of the global norms. And I think this is partly why states are so happy to fund and create these large organizations like the IOM, because it makes it appear as if they're, tipping their hat to these global norms, these migration norms. But at the end of the day, what are states doing? They're serving their economic and security interests as they see them. But nonetheless, national law, state law within states is the predominant factor determining the rules that international migrants are subject to. Secondarily, then would come international law. International law is, of course, not the same as domestic law, because whereas domestic law has not only legislative capacity, but enforcement capacity. And in many ways, international law has that positive legislative component. It can bring laws into being. But the question of whether or not we should even call them laws has been debated because there is no enforcement mechanism. At the international level, today we have the UN General Assembly that passes resolutions. And when the General Assembly passes a resolution, it's a little bit like when a parliament or a Congress gets together and each representative in the Congress or the parliament votes on a piece of legislation. And if it gets enough votes, it passes, it becomes a law. Well, the same thing is kind of happening at the international level through a body like the UN General Assembly, where each seat in the General Assembly is a member state of the UN. One state, one vote in the General Assembly. Just like in a domestic situation, one representative or one congressperson, one vote. But the major difference is Canada, Britain, the US has the capacity to enforce their laws. If you break a law, even one so minor as a parking ticket, think about what will happen. You don't pay your parking ticket, and then you don't respond, and then you don't pay the interest on the parking ticket, and then you don't respond to a summons to court. If you do not abide by the rule of the law, eventually you will end up in prison. There are enforcement mechanisms. International law doesn't work that way. They can pass what they call laws or make international law, but lacking a central government to enforce it, there's something aspirational, something euphemistic or idealistic in the notion of international law. There are some mechanisms built into the UN and international law that provide for a modicum of enforcement capacity, but the primary enforcement capacity in international law is the will of individual states. Sort of, does a state, if a powerful state chooses not to follow an international law, there is no global police force or court of law that has the capacity to hold them to account. Weak states, the weaker states for sure, can kind of be coerced, or the international system might have enough in it to carry out some enforcement capacity. But in general, international law lacks enforcement capacity. And in fact, when a new law is passed, it's usually treaty based. So a better analog to understand what international law is compared to domestic law is not that international law is the same sort of thing that's coming out of parliaments and congresses, but rather it's comparable to contract law in the domestic setting. So if I sign a contract to sell you my house, here's the contract. This is what I'm going to give you. This is what you're going to pay for it. That's the contract. We've agreed to it. We've signed on the dotted line. That's kind of what international law is. It's like contract law. Individual states can sign up to law. So a new treaty is being proposed for human rights. Each state will look at it. They'll look at the text. They'll evaluate whether or not they think this is something that would benefit them. And they can either sign on to the new law or not. And if they don't sign on to a new treaty, they're not subject to it. That's another major difference with the domestic setting. In an individual state within a particular country, it doesn't matter whether or not you say, yeah, I'm going to accept that law. You don't get to pick and choose. Well, internationally, you do get to pick and choose. If you don't sign up for the treaty, technically it's not binding on you. And even if you do sign up for it and it's technically binding, there may not be an enforcement capacity to actually hold you to account. So there are all sorts of differences between international law and domestic law. They're almost so different that a lot of scholars have suggested it's a misnomer and we should have found a different name for it other than international law because it gives a false impression. But such as it is, the major statutes that are out there governing global migration are perhaps first and foremost the 1951 Refugee Convention. This is the treaty that potentially affects a state's sovereign decision on what they do with their borders and who they let in more than any other treaty, because in part it's been so widely endorsed. Most countries in the world have signed on to the Refugee Convention. And basically what it says is, if someone shows up at your borders and claims that they're fleeing persecution from the state is persecuting them because of their identity. Maybe the state is persecuting them because of their race or their religious beliefs or their political views, and your life is in danger or you're threatened with harm. Then you say, well, I want to seek refuge somewhere else. If you show up to another state and say, please let me in, I can't go back to my country, I'm being persecuted. All countries that signed the Refugee Convention have an obligation under international law to hear the asylum claim. Doesn't mean they have to accept it, but you at least have to hear it. So if someone shows up saying, I'm being persecuted, and you don't let them in to hear their concern or you send them back, you're in breach of international law. So states are required to hear those asylum claims. They're also required to have adjudicating bodies set up domestically to evaluate whether the claims meet the criteria set out in the international treaty. And if it does, then that state is required to accept the refugee if they make their own internal determination in their courts or their judges or their panel that they've set up to adjudicate it. If they say, yeah, that looks like this person's story checks out, we have to give them refuge. Yes.
And I understood, and correct me if I'm wrong, that this also happens when you've done wrong things, like if the country you are from punishes you or trying to impose your punishment with that penalty, you can go in another country to ask for asylum just because otherwise they would have killed you.
Yes, there's a couple of catches to that. So if I understand your question, you're saying that if a person says, "I'm afraid my government is going to potentially kill me or lock me up," I'm seeking asylum. Well, it depends why you're seeking asylum. So, for example, if the state is trying to lock you up in a cell for the rest of your life because you've committed a crime, that doesn't count under the Refugee Convention. You're, you have to be, not only must your life be in danger, but it has to be in danger because of state persecution because of your identity. So, as in your religion, your political views, your race, um, these sorts of things, you have to say, look, this isn't my fault. I didn't break the law. I didn't break the crime. I'm being persecuted because of who I am or what I believe. That then triggers the Refugee Convention. Notice that that excludes a lot. It doesn't cover, for example, let's suppose your whole society collapses, your law and order breaks down, the police departments, the police services aren't functioning, and there's basically chaos in the streets. It's a failed state. My life is in danger here. I'm going to go seek refuge somewhere else. Excuse me, neighboring country. I can't go back to my country. My life's in danger. Please take me in. The Refugee Convention doesn't cover that. They'll say, well, I'm sorry about your situation, but the state that you're coming from isn't persecuting you because of your identity. It just has a lot of problems. And another example would be a natural disaster. If a tsunami or a earthquake decimates the country and its infrastructure is destroyed, people are starving, you go to seek refuge in another state. I want to claim asylum here. Is the state persecuting you because of your identity? No, but the country's falling apart. Sorry, we're not going to hear it. So the Refugee Convention was very narrowly confined because the last thing the states who signed on to the treaty, the last thing they wanted was a lot of people claiming asylum at their borders for this, that, and the other reason. They said, okay, we'll make an exception. We'll commit to hearing the asylum claim. We'll commit to taking in legitimate refugees if the reason they're fleeing is state persecution based on identity. And that's it. Not even war. So if your country is ravaged by war and people are being enlisted and people are being killed, there's bombs going off in the street, you go to the next neighboring country to claim asylum. They'll say, well, I'm sorry, there's a war going on, but you're not being persecuted based on your identity, so we're not obligated to hear your case. Now, that doesn't mean that states, any particular government, might still take a hospitable position and say, we hear your concern, come on in, we'll take care of you. For the most part, states being self-interested and very guarding of their borders will say, well, we only agreed to hear refugee claims based on that convention, which is very narrowly defined. And there are even more problematic things with the Refugee Convention. Like, for example, it only applies to refugees created after 1951. So there's 6 or 7 million Palestinian refugees who aren't included under the Refugee Convention. They're legally not entitled to make refugee claims if they're being persecuted for their identity because they're not covered by the convention. In fact, the Palestinian refugee problem is covered by a whole distinct UN agency called UNRWA, which has been in the news lately. UNRWA, the UN Refugee and Works Agency, which is an agency that was established right after 1948 to specifically take care of the Palestinian people in the wake of their displacement and the creation of Israel. So anyway, the Refugee Convention is one of the few pieces of international law that has a clear requirement for states to let people in, but only under these narrow criteria. And it's come under all sorts of criticism because there's a push now to say, why don't we broaden the Refugee Convention to permit people who are fleeing for their lives for any reason, whether it's natural disasters, war, organized crime, whatever. We should be, a person who's fleeing for their life is a person who's fleeing for their life. And I think this seems like the obvious humanitarian thing to do, but states would say they just fear that they would be bombarded by people showing up at their borders because the world is full of problems. The world is full of people in need. They would be afraid that if they signed up to be committed to take people in that circumstance, there's too many scenarios they could imagine where there would be thousands of people legally entitled to come in fleeing some form of destitution. So I think states are pretty happy to keep it in this very narrow criteria, even though progressive movements, a lot of NGOs are saying it's very inadequate and needs to be expanded. For example, to include climate-induced migration.
And we've got a comment in the chat, and we've also got a question from Juliana. So I'll read the comment first. This is from Tasnia, just saying that the majority of Rohingya people seeking refuge in Bangladesh have not been recognized as refugees and are instead called forcibly displaced Myanmar nationals to retain state sovereignty and shirk away operations towards those displaced. There's a domestic law called the Foreigners Act, the national framework that's used as primary government tools there.
Thank you, Tasnia. That's a very interesting point about how even though this refugee convention, limited as it is, doesn't apply to people who you think it would apply to in the spirit of the law. Another example are the Syrians in Turkey. It doesn't. Turkey has an exception when it signed the treaty. So technically, the Syrians that Turkey has taken in aren't refugees according to international law. They have a protected status, protected person status, or some jargon like that.
And then Liana has a question.
Liliana, go ahead.
Sorry, I just wanted to take advantage because when I was looking you up and I saw that you have expertise on Palestinian refugees, and I had no idea that they weren't covered by the convention, but I was curious. I don't know if this is like a worldwide thing, but in the US, like there's two different figures for refugees who like are assigned via the UN system and from a third country versus like asylum seekers who cross the border and then apply for asylum within the territorial boundaries of the US. And I was curious, like, does that mean that Palestinians also can't apply for asylum? I don't know. Again, this is like I'm a little biased because I only really know the US immigration like norms in depth, and maybe it's not like that everywhere else. But like my understanding is that like the US asylum system is like internal regulation that like takes into account the 1951 convention, but that like is separate from their consideration of who's a refugee and more based on like individual circumstance. So I don't know, maybe it's like also if you just want to like recommend something I could read and not get into it, that's fine. But I wanted to ask. Thanks.
Thank you. That sounds like a great question. I'm not 100% sure if I know the answer, but I will say we have a whole session on refugees and asylum seekers coming up. I think on Wednesday or Thursday. We'll be going in depth, so that should all of this, any interest that we've piqued on this should hopefully be addressed there. But my understanding with the U.S. system is simply that until the U.S. has heard the claim and said, yeah, it checks out, this person is a legitimate refugee according to the Refugee Convention, they're counted as an asylum seeker. So asylum seeker and refugee are two different terms. Asylum seekers want to become refugees because refugee means that now that you're a refugee, once a state has determined that an asylum seeker meets the requirements, they say, okay, you're a bona fide refugee, and that means that you now get social rights within the country. Under the Refugee Convention, the host state, having determined that an asylee meets the required criteria, they must then be afforded comparable social rights to social services, to whatever basic Americans have access to as social rights. Refugees need to as well. Notice it doesn't apply to political rights, so that means that they don't get to automatically become citizens with all the rights, the political rights that come with citizenship, but in terms of social services and social protections, they're supposed to be on par. Yes, and then we could get into the fascinating discussions about how when the U.S. Started putting the migrant caravans and the asylum seekers showing up at the southern border into camps in Mexico, I think they call it the Remain in Mexico policy or something like that, they're in breach of their duties under the 1951 convention. They are supposed to, if someone knocks at the door, they're supposed to let them in and hear their claim. They're saying, we see you out there, but wait out there for a while. We'll maybe hear your claim when we get to it. That's a violation of the letter of the law. So the U.S. is in breach of the law in that sense. But maybe I think we'll park our discussion of refugees and asylum seekers for later. Thank you for this. Yes, please.
Yeah, I don't think it speaks to governance in the sense of cross-border cooperation between the U.S. and Mexico, and global governance as well. Because I think to be a refugee and get that immediate refugee status, you have to be referred by UNHCR. So that's what happens in Canada. So like you get flights with refugees that then go to the immigration settlement services versus asylum, where that's why the Mexican border is so important because there is a way to make it from rest of the world into Mexico, and then the problem is crossing Mexico getting to the southern border. And what they did is externalize the waiting time for like there's an app called CBP1 where they have to wait for that interview or they would claim for asylum, but they do so in Mexico. Like Mexico accepted that in exchange for some other like security or money or something like that.
Yes.
So there's like all of these other economic interests that then, in terms of like cross-border governance, ends up affecting migrants from different nationalities, including Mexicans, and like as people who come from more far away are harder to deport. So they're also like just waiting at the at the border versus like if you are Mexican or Central American, if you manage to make it to the border, they are going to deport you back into Mexico because it's closer. But if you are from Afghanistan, for example, then you would have to be in the US, be detained there while you wait for like your asylum claim. So it's like all of this.
I see. Yes. So the U.S. is discriminating based on the source country of the person trying to access and make an asylum claim. And I think that's because of bilateral agreements with the U.S. and Mexico. So countries are always signing these sort of bilateral agreements, and Canada and the U.S. have one. It's called a Safe Third Country Agreement that allows them to sort of shirk their international obligations. If not the letter, then certainly the spirit of the Refugee Convention law. It's circumvented when states say, well, you know what, let's make an agreement that'll make it easier for us to, keep people from coming in and, defer asylum claims.
We've got the just so you know.
Yes, we have some questions in the chat. Let me just read out a couple of comments here from Tasnia and Madison, and then we'll go to who had a hand raised?
Nora.
And then we'll go to Nora. So Tasnia writes, UK sending asylum seekers to Rwanda. Yes, I heard about that. Flights or something were started the other day. Is another example of signatory states not really thinking of protecting displaced populations. Yes, the theme, the trend of states over the last 10 or 20 years is finding creative ways to sidestep, bend around, evade, and shirk their international obligations, if not just ethically, then even legally under the letter of these treaties. And Madison writes, regarding migrants leaving Myanmar, it's a similar situation for the Karen people, I'm not sure how to say that, entering into Thailand from Myanmar. Thailand is not a signatory of the 1951 convention and considers fleeing Karen people as illegal migrants in Thailand, although some are able to enter legally with documentation, right? The Karen people are restricted to temporary shelters, and the conditions in these shelters are very poor. They have very little options, if any. Yes, there's parts of the world where I think huge populations in distress would love to be considered under the Refugee Convention, but through various accidents of history or state policy, local geopolitics, they're either ignored or they've just been excluded from the letter of the law. And let's see.
Nora had a question.
Nora, are you available to hop in?
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Michael. So I have a question. You mentioned that more than 7.5 million Palestinian refugees around the world are not covered under the Refugee Convention. Is that right?
Yes.
Can you please shed light why or what was the reason that they are not covered under the Refugee Convention, even though they are refugees, and UNRWA give them the status of refugees. You know that UNRWA give cards, UNRWA cards that state that these are people who are refugees, and but that they are still not covered under the convention.
Yes. They're not convention refugees. And so we need to differentiate between sort of common language when people use the term refugee in an informal, unofficial way, to mean anybody fleeing some sort of distressful situation. There's no doubt that Palestinians who have been displaced, lost their homes, wherever they are in the world today, could be considered refugees in this sense. But they're not legally considered 1951 convention refugees, and here's why. Because right after the founding of Israel, what's called the Nakba for Palestinians is when basically their country was wiped off the map. Hundreds of towns and cities, villages were depopulated or bulldozed. Hundreds of thousands of people were pushed into Gaza, pushed into the West Bank, pushed into neighboring countries. It was a humanitarian crisis. And the new UN, the very young UN, recognized this and created an agency to provide social services for them. And they created the UNRWA agency. UNRWA is the agency for Palestinian refugees. So Palestinians may not be convention refugees under international law, but they're UNRWA refugees. So what happened was you had this UN organization dedicated to one people, the Palestinians, and then a few years later, trying to deal with refugees at a more global level, the UN passes the Refugee Convention in 1951. But there was the talk at the time was, well, hold on, we have to exclude the Palestinians, otherwise they're double dipping. They already have an agency with sets of institutions and prerogative states. Member states of the UN are funding UNRWA, providing services to the Palestinians. So they're in a category of their own with an institution already dedicated to them. So they were deliberately excluded from the 1951 convention, which on the one hand, you can see it makes a little bit of sense, but on the other hand, it has confined Palestinians to this limbo situation where as refugees, they're entitled to education and healthcare, and they've been getting it until this Gaza war. They've been getting, Palestinian people are some of the most literate, educated, healthy people in the world, despite the occupation and the wars and the displacement, because of UNRWA services that are provided to them. So UNRWA does a great job providing social services, but it's kept them trapped in a situation where they don't have the luxury of applying for asylum claims in other countries that other refugees around the world do. So it's a very bizarre situation that Palestinians are in. Did you want to follow up on that?
Okay, I have another point. So this means that Palestinian refugees are not entitled to the refugees' rights under the convention. Is that right? Because they are a different case or like a special case. Is that right?
That's right. Palestinians are not covered by the 1951 convention.
So this means that they are entitled to the rights. And I want to just make sure that what is believed or agreed on the human rights of refugees, of like the global term of refugees, they are only specific for them, not for the Palestinian refugees.
I think I heard most of what you said, but if I heard you correctly, you're asking if they're still entitled to the same human rights as other refugees?
Yes.
Well, I think that human rights isn't the best term here legally, because I wouldn't say that the 1951 Refugee Convention applies human rights to refugees. It may indirectly, but what it requires is that individual states, upon receiving an asylum request in their country or at their border, they have to give it serious consideration and potentially take them in if it qualifies. Not with consideration to human rights, but with consideration to whether or not they've been persecuted by a state based on their identity. And I would say that human rights are a difficult topic because there is no enforcement mechanism for anyone with human rights except for national governments. So really, we talk about human rights. Human rights is a big part of global norms. We have all of these aspirational documents like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, all of these discourses and all of these organizations that center human rights. But at the end of the day, they're just trying to change hearts and minds. They're trying to persuade people to make these things matter because there is no UN organization that can go in and enforce human rights. The only candidate who can do that is the Security Council. And the Security Council is specifically mandated not to enforce human rights issues or to deal with human rights violations, but the UN Security Council's chartered mandate is to deal with issues of international peace and security. So the UN Security Council would say, well, is this a matter of war and peace, or is it a matter of human rights? It's a matter of human rights. We're going to not get involved. And that leaves human rights violations at the whim of states. So unfortunately, without an enforcement mechanism, it comes down to what's your nationality? What passport do you have? What state do you have backing you up? Because as much as we like to think or want people to have the same rights based on their humanity, we're just in the domain of idealist discourse shaping on that topic. Now, I'm not sure if that's what you were getting at. Did you want to try rephrasing your question? I want to make sure that I understand.
I want to update you because you said that Palestinian refugees are not eligible for asylum seeker because UNRWA is taking care of that. I want to let you know that I worked in a file that was very successful for a Palestinian refugee to come to Canada as an asylum seeker because he was living outside the area of operations, of UNRWA operations. So he wasn't in any of the area of operation like Jordan or Lebanon or Egypt or Palestinian territories, and he was granted that asylum seeker right. You know, the argument was that he wasn't there to be covered by the social services. Yes, and it was a very successful case. So this is from my own professional experience.
Interesting. And where did that person live?
He lives in the Gulf region.
Aha. So I guess because
he left, he's living now in Canada.
I see. So the UNRWA refugees only applies to those physically under its social service umbrella.
Yes, where they live, like if they live in Lebanon or Syria or Jordan or the Palestinian authorities or Egypt sometimes, if they are able to access any of these social services or any kind of, support, so they are not eligible. But if they are outside these areas or these zones, then they can think of the case and discuss the circumstances, and based on that, they are eligible to asylum seeker. And this has been successful with one of my clients.
Awesome. Thank you for that. So do you know if they were treated literally under the Refugee Convention or if Canada just decided to treat them in an equivalent way?
It was under the UNCHR, and because they received the IOM bag, the same protocol when we deal here in Canada with the Syrian refugees or with the Afghani refugees or the Sudanese, Somalis, because I'm working on these files too. I have experience with all of them. So it was my guess just under the UNCHR.
Yes, and that makes total sense. Mm-hmm. Thank you for that.
No worries, thanks.
Okay, let's see. I think we heard from Liliana.
And Liliana has a couple of comments here. Sharing the U.S. border externalization and the incarceration of patients crossing the Caribbean of this military base at Guantanamo Bay. And I had a point as well. So during this war, we heard that there was funding, there's some controversy with UNRWA. So, and Israel accused them of a lot of
bad things.
Yeah. So, how does that accusation compromise the global governance? We look at like an accusation of that. Where does it land? And how is it processed by the international system? Because I think it's a bold accusation that undermines a lot of the work and the services provided by these organizations. And I'm just curious because I'm just curious, what are these accusations and criticism of all of these things?
Yes, I just want to make sure I've addressed these comments and I come back to it. So Liliana had made this interesting comment about Haitians and Guantanamo Bay. That's a very sordid history. And then regarding the confusing situation for Palestinians, Yes. So again, Nora clarified exactly that distinction for us. Now, for example, displaced Holocaust refugees like my family had. Yes. So uh, yes, I mean, Jewish refugees had their own bag of problems as well, trying to find safe haven in Europe in the ruins of World War II. And so before that refugee convention was signed and ratified, you had clearly a group that was persecuted for their identity. Countries like Canada were able just to say without any sort of consequence, no, we're not going to take any refugees. Oh, what? That boat wants to come here? No, turn them away. I think in part the refugee convention was born out of a public backlash to the horrors of the Holocaust and the treatment of Jewish refugees in need. Um, Now, Tasnia or Liliana, feel free to jump in to follow up or elaborate, but I want to go back to your point about the question regarding what sort of damage was done with accusations from Israel that UNRWA was involved in supporting terrorists. Yes. And so the one possible explanation is that Israel had some intelligence that militants, armed fighters were using UNRWA, its offices, its facilities to transfer fighters, weapons, munitions, and maybe even had some employees who took part in the attacks on October 7th. Now, as far as I know, no evidence has ever been.
That was disproven.
Yes. Yeah. So many countries said, oh, is that true, Israel? Okay, well, we're shutting down funding to UNRWA. This is a UN agency. If they're doing that, we're not going to send our money quota this year to them. And even UNRWA did, it fired people without evidence that Israel has claimed were involved. And then the world said, so let's see this evidence. And then it was never produced.
Yeah.
And there's no evidence that there is evidence. So basically, one by one, states have started resuming their funding commitments to UNRWA.
But I think it's pretty strange to hurl this accusation, and it does delegitimize the work of these international organizations.
It literally put them under a crosshair
Yeah.
because it basically you put in the public discourse that this organization, under the guise of doing humanitarian work, is supporting terrorists trying to destroy my people. Suddenly, you've got more and more UNRWA workers being targeted by snipers or airstrikes, and not only that, but the almost collapse in funding overnight, which I don't know if that was constitutional or not, if states are allowed to do that on an elevation. But it basically meant that UNRWA could barely keep its operations afloat in an already challenging situation.
And it's kind of like, I thought, like, if it's possible, how quickly that happened. I wonder how funding could be reversed for any other organization. As so many of these people who are refugees who rely on this funding. So if that's how quickly the funding gets reversed, it's pretty scary.
I suspect that there's something in the charters and the mandates that say that states are not obligated to pay their dues if the organizations aren't undertaking their function. So that's probably what governments like Trudeau or whatever, oh, okay, well, we can withhold funding if they're involved in terrorist activities. But actually, there should be an investigation before any funding is withdrawn. And there was no investigation. They just took Israel at its word. So most likely, if you want my candid opinion about what happened, most likely Israel didn't seriously think UNRWA was guilty of complicity in terrorism, but is very concerned because UNRWA is like one of the conditions for Palestinian society and life and health in that part of the world. And if Israel has a problem with too many Palestinians on its doorstep or in its occupied territories, UNRWA is a big problem because it makes education good, it provides health care, it makes the conditions of life possible. So you want to target that organization to make the conditions of life impossible. That's a cynical reading. I can only speculate, but that's kind of what it looks like.
That's how it looked like outside.
What I'm saying is there's an obvious double standard if the Holocaust refugees receive different consideration than the Palestinians. Yes, off the top of my head, I think that the Holocaust survivors did not really receive any better treatment than the Palestinians, at least at first, because the amount of anti-Semitism, national nativism, xenophobia every country, no countries in Europe wanted any of those Jewish refugees. That's why it was a crisis. You had hundreds of thousands of displaced Jewish people across Europe who didn't have a home to go back to because their homes, their communities were destroyed, and none of the other European countries wanted them. The United States didn't want them. Canada didn't want them. England didn't want them. Nobody was accepting them. And I think that part of that condition, in a way, inadvertently fueled the creation of the state of Israel because Israel became that safe haven that the rest of the world wasn't offering. But come 1951, a few years later, um, I think the question of Jewish refugees had more or less been solved. And so I don't think that the 1951 convention had much benefit or application to the Jewish refugees of World War II. But I have to double check on the exact status of, because the Refugee Convention specifically says it only applies to refugees created after 1951. So I don't think it would have applied to Jewish refugees of the Holocaust anyway. But they had a state of Israel to go to after 1948, and the Palestinians had no state to go to. And yes, that's correct. The Holocaust is cited rhetorically as an impetus for the convention signing. It's this whole never again mantra. When the world realized what horrors were done, as it slowly woke up to what the Holocaust really was, then there is this sort of a kickstarting in global civil society and among NGOs. Well, we need to double down on human rights. We need to create a refugee convention so this doesn't happen again. We need to have a genocide treaty. I think the situation of the Holocaust led rather indirectly, but in a significant way, to the 1951 Refugee Convention, to the 1948 Genocide Convention. It was, hugely, and to an expansion of the Geneva Conventions. Another major international treaty that would govern states' obligations with regards to their treatment of foreign, people coming from other countries is the Convention on Migrant Workers, the International Convention on the Protections of Migrant Workers and their Families. But it requires states to fulfill a lot of obligations, duties, and services to people in this situation, so a lot of states never signed it. I think something like 50 some states to date have signed the 1990 Convention on Migrant Workers. So for a lot of countries, it's not really applicable. It doesn't apply. And I think this is partly why we've had things like the Global Compact developed in 2018, which are non-binding, just to get more states on board, at least rhetorically and figuratively, if not by the letter of a binding law. But a couple other nods here. In the year 2000, human trafficking received a major piece of international legislation with the Protocol on Trafficking in Persons, signed by most countries in the world, which basically obligates states to begin looking for signs of human trafficking, some of the responsibilities or obligations they have towards individuals they suspect are being trafficked, and commitments to prosecuting traffickers. So this is a major sort of regime in international law pertaining to migration and trafficking in humans in particular. Now, you could also include in this category of international law in global migration governance aspects of the UN Charter, aspects of the UN Declaration of Human Rights, aspects of various human rights treaties, because even though they're not focused on migration issues, it often sort of overlaps with them. So yeah, national law, which is the most determinative set of rules in the global migration governance. International law, which is secondary, and third, you have these sort of non-binding, aspirational, kind of feel-good statements and compacts, like, for example, the 2015 SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, list of 17, I think, sort of aspirations, goals, targets, the countries who signed on to it. So it goes through the UN General Assembly, countries vote to sign on to it or not, but they're stipulated. This is a document of the way we want the world to be. This is a document of how we would like to see things governed, but it's non-legally binding, unlike a conventional treaty. And then likewise, as we've been saying a few times now, the 2018 UN Global Compact for Safe, Orderly, and Regular Migration is this rather comprehensive document. In fact, I have a bit of a spotlight on it here. So if we look a little bit more closely at it, got the logo for the agreement. It's heavily branded, right? It goes through focus groups. It's very euphemistic. But I don't want to completely write off the value of these sorts of non-binding initiatives because there's something to them. They create a culture of norms. They reinforce a set of expectations of the way states ought to act. So even when states aren't legally obligated to act in certain ways, things like this create a context in which there's political pressure to do so. So even though they don't always have teeth, they can still have a lot of influence. And this global compact, as it says here, a comprehensive framework for migration governance, emphasizing rights and well-being of migrants, while also recognizing the sovereignty of states. Hey, listen, states, we know you're sovereign entities. Nobody can intervene on your sovereignty. The UN can't tell you what to do, and this compact isn't going to tell you what to do. You're the sovereign. But wouldn't it be nice if we thought about these other things? Aims at mobilizing data and streamlining cooperation, trying to open the doors to communication, trying to establish forums for states, governments, and officials to begin talking about these things to hopefully take more meaningful action. And as it indicates in the last bullet here, it's regarded as a compromise or a softer alternative to that 1990 Convention on Migrant Workers. A couple quick points that we can fly through these last couple slides really quickly. A problem here, global governance is very complex, fragmented, lacks enforcement. And here's just a few examples. There's the refugee regime, which has different sets of bodies and organizations and rules that apply, separate from the travel regime, UN World Tourism Organization. Then there's the labor regime for economic migrants. And these things are all kind of carved up and chopped up in ways that can seem arbitrary or not really capture the situation of a specific individual. And there's a kind of a blurring of the lines between international legal treaty obligations and kind of this soft neoliberal kind of discourse around rights. So some problems with this global governance regime, no doubt. And maybe the most important thing is, where are all the migrants in all of this governance? Because the global governance regime for migration doesn't include migrants. We talk about it including non-state actors like civil society organizations or different kind of associations. Even church groups, churches, and church organizations become significant actors in the migration regime. When you have or labor unions, when they're able to sponsor refugees for resettlement, they're players in the system. But migrants themselves, as individuals, don't actually have a place in any of this global governance except as kind of passive recipients. Then we've talked about the problematic categories that say you're either this or that, when the reality is often blurred. Many migrants or refugees could be filed into multiple categories at the same time. Much of this is based in this very, I think, interesting concept in political theory called methodological nationalism. Methodological nationalism is basically a fancy way of saying a nation bias or the national bias. So I think it's incumbent, and many researchers in migration studies, border studies are saying, we have this kind of filter that we view the world through. Let's call it methodological nationalism, because every method or approach that we try to undertake, we are applying the national criteria, which says that those who are included are of a common national identity. And by de facto, if you're not of that national identity, well, you're something other. We don't afford you the same human rights considerations. We don't afford you the same applications under law. And the line so often hinges on whether or not you're the right nation. What's your national identity? What nation state are you from? And we tend to think that nations, nationalism, and nation state are the primary units and areas of differentiation that determine how people should be treated. And there are calls to dismantle this methodological geographical nationalism for a much more humanistic approach to politics and governance. We've talked about the rise of nationalist, nativist politics that counteract migration trends. And migration research literatures today are really quite progressive, and for the most part are emphasizing and trying to advance the norms of migration, trying to center migrant agency and migrant experience. But these migration academics are very often siloed in their disciplines, and they have very little impact on actual policy options and political realities. Just this closing point here, governments have a lot of policy options, but and a lot of norms to guide as sort of as a compass for their policies, and a lot of international treaties to sort of look to conform to. But political realities tend to overrule all of those considerations, and whatever the research says, whatever the law says, whatever the norm says, political realities in the day, often driven by economic precarity, lack of trust in authorities, are a major roadblock in the development of global migration governance.